Rain fell over Vale Memorial Hospital the night Alpha King Lucian Vale bought it, and the cameras outside the emergency entrance caught every drop of it glinting silver under the floodlights. He crossed the threshold in a suit that cost more than most families in his pack would see in a year, flanked by board members bowing just low enough to be respectful, just high enough to still be watching him for weakness. Somewhere behind him, a press liaison was already drafting a statement about legacy and stability, about a father's devotion, about the Vale name standing behind the pack's finest medical institution for another generation. He had not purchased Vale Memorial for its reputation, or its donor halls, or the gleaming alpha blood bank the press loved to photograph. He had purchased it because his son was dying inside it, and no one could tell him why. On the top floor, in a private pediatric suite meant for exactly one child, Cassian Vale burned with a fever hot enough to melt the silver casing on the monitors beside his bed. Doctors circled him with instruments that returned no answers. Hospital Director Corvin Hale suggested, gently, that it might be rogue contamination, an infection carried in from outside the pack's clean bloodlines. Lady Maris Vale, Lucian's mother, stood at the foot of the bed and demanded the lower wards be sealed immediately to protect what she called the only blood in the building worth protecting. Outside, in the rain, security dragged a nurse through the emergency doors and threw her out onto the wet pavement like something contaminated. The cameras had come to film a billionaire father saving his son. Instead, they caught a soaked Omega nurse being thrown into the rain with a child's blood still on her hands. And for one long moment, no one in the press pool knew which story they were supposed to be filming. Her scrubs were soaked through. Her hands still carried the faint pink stain of a child's blood she had not had time to wash off. Her name was Elara Wren, and she was shouting through the glass doors that they were treating the fever wrong, that they had always been treating it wrong, before two more guards pulled her further into the storm. Lucian looked at her the way a man looks at a threat he has not yet identified. Corvin told him she had been terminated for what the hospital's internal report called curse contamination, and that removing her from the building had been standard procedure. Lucian asked her, over the noise of the rain and the guards, what she knew. Elara lifted her eyes to the lit window of the VIP ward far above them, where she could feel, even from the ground, the ember burning brighter than it had in years. "Your son is not sick because I touched him," she said. "He is sick because your hospital learned which children it could let die. Long before that night, long before the silver monitors and the sealed wards. Elara Wren had been a pediatric night nurse, the kind other staff whispered about because no fevered, frightened child ever cried for long once she was in the room. She did not need a chart to know a child's name. She remembered symptoms, allergies, the exact octave of a cry that meant pain instead of fear, and the quiet hallway routes that let her move between wards no one else bothered to walk. The other nurses called her fever rat behind her back because her skin ran warmer than it should, because something about her always seemed to know when a child down the hall had taken a turn for the worse before any monitor confirmed it. What none of them knew, not fully, was that Elara carried the old and nearly forgotten bloodline of a fever-cursed Luna. Whenever a child within the pack's jurisdiction was denied the medical care they needed, whether for rank, bloodline, money, missing insurance, or rogue status, an ember bloomed somewhere in her blood and stayed there, burning, until the truth behind it was finally treated. Her curse did not heal children. It made neglect impossible to cool. The wound beneath all of it belonged to her brother Nico, who had died outside Vale Memorial's own doors years before Elara ever wore its uniform. He had been burning with fever the night their mother carried him to the emergency entrance, and security had refused them both at the gate because their family carried no pack insurance, no registered papers, nothing the scanners recognized as valuable. By the time anyone finally checked, Nico was gone. The hospital's official record did not read denied. It read arrived without vital signs, as though he had already been dead when he reached them, as though no one had turned him away while his small chest still rose and fell against his mother's arms. They did not refuse him after he died, Elara often thought, in the years that followed. They refused him while he was still asking to live. She became a nurse not because she trusted hospitals, but because she refused to let another child die outside a white door while someone inside decided whether his blood was worth the trouble of opening it. Vale Memorial itself was a masterpiece of modern medicine, gleaming, spotless, and profoundly unequal beneath its polish. It held a VIP alpha ward reserved for pack royalty, a private pediatric wing with suites larger than most family homes, an alpha blood bank kept at exacting temperatures, donor halls lined with brass plaques, and, buried far below all of it, a sealed lower intake and a charity basement that most of the hospital's own staff had never once visited. Lucian had funded the place for years, believing it stood as the finest legacy his family name could offer the pack. He had signed an order once, without much thought, that read simply, "Critical resources must follow highest pack continuity value." Lady Maris had reinforced it in her own words, telling the board plainly that if the hospital ever had to choose, it should choose the blood that kept the pack standing. Under Corvin Hale's direction, that single principle metastasized into the hospital's unofficial law, a blood priority system where noble children were admitted instantly, Omega children waited, rogue children were quietly redirected elsewhere, and children without pack papers vanished from the records as though they had never been born at all. Elara had spent months working around that system in the only way she knew, using leftover medicine, trading shifts, keeping a private notebook of names the hospital refused to write down anywhere official. One night, she used medicine drawn from the VIP storage shelf to save a rogue boy whose lungs had nearly given out, medicine that was, by every technical measure, expired within the week anyway. Corvin caught her before she finished the injection. He called it theft from alpha heirs. She told him the medicine was dying on a shelf while the child in front of her was dying in a bed, and that the difference between those two facts should have mattered to somebody in that building. It did not matter enough. Security removed her that same night, and the hospital's official statement labeled her a curse contamination risk, a danger to the wards she had spent years protecting. Lady Maris, informed of the incident secondhand, called her a fever rat and considered the matter closed. It was less than a week later that Cassian's fever spiked past anything Vale Memorial's finest doctors could explain. A bitter irony that the hospital had just discarded the only person in the building who might have understood exactly what was happening to him. Lucian brought her back into the VIP ward with obvious reluctance, overruling doctors who protested, and a director who called it dangerous, because nothing else had worked, and his son's breathing had grown shallow enough to frighten even him. Elara stood at Cassian's bedside and understood almost immediately that this was not an ordinary illness. The room around her told its own story before she even touched him. Silk sheets, a private nurse rotation, monitors flown in from 3 countries, and none of it able to bring the boy's temperature down by even a degree. It was not a virus. It was not simple poison. It was something she had never seen expressed this strongly before. An echo fever. A fever built from the accumulated neglect of many children, all of them abandoned inside the same oath-bound hospital system. All of that neglect was finally reflecting back through the one child whose blood the hospital valued above all others. Cassian's suffering was, in its own terrible way, the hospital's own priorities turned inside out, poured back into the one body it claimed to protect most. Scanning the room, Elara noticed small toys tucked beneath the ventilation grate near the floor, hidden as if a child had been leaving them there deliberately. Lucian did not understand why that detail mattered. She asked Cassian gently if he had ever heard children crying somewhere below his room. Half-conscious, burning. The boy whispered an answer that stopped his father's heart in his chest. The baby under the floor stopped crying. Cassian had been leaving toys beneath the vent for weeks, believing, in the quiet logic of an 8-year-old, that the children below him might be scared of the dark, and that a small gift dropped through the grate might help. His son had known the lower ward existed before Lucian himself had ever set foot near it. Elara told him plainly that treating Cassian alone would only buy time, that the fever would return unless its true source was addressed. Lucian's anger flared, certain for a moment that she was using his son's suffering as leverage for reform. "I do not need your son to prove children are dying," she told him. "I need you to stop pretending he is the only child in this hospital." When her fingers brushed Cassian's wrist and Lucian's hand settled beside hers on the blanket, the mate bond stirred between them, warm and unmistakable. She buried the feeling immediately. A bond meant nothing if the man carrying it still believed his son's life outweighed every other child sleeping somewhere beneath his hospital's polished floors. Determined to understand the full scope of what she was facing, Elara demanded to see the hospital's intake records. Corvin produced clean reports, no deaths, no refused children, no rogue pediatric cases anywhere on file, a hospital history scrubbed to spotless perfection. She pressed her palm against the glass wall, separating the ward from the corridor, and the embers in her blood surfaced as a map of heat across her skin, pointing unmistakably downward, toward the lower intake, the old supply wing, and the charity basement Vale Memorial rarely acknowledged existed. Lucian asked the board how many children had been refused care that year. No one could answer him. His hospital knew the temperature of every vial of alpha blood in its vaults, tracked every donation contract to the hour, and monitored his son's oxygen levels down to the second. It did not know the names of the children who had burned outside its doors. For the first time, Lucian understood that his hospital's failure was not a data problem. It was a conscience problem, and he had funded it for years without once asking the question that mattered. Desperate to reach the hidden lower ward before more children worsened, and unwilling to wait through Corvin's endless approval process while Cassian himself grew sicker, Elara made a choice she would spend the rest of the story paying for. She quietly moved medicine down to the sealed lower ward through Nurse Hannah Reed, an old friend willing to help but not yet willing to be seen helping, and she did not log the transfer in any official record, certain that any paper trail would only give Corvin a chance to block it. The medicine never reached the children as she intended. Corvin had already replaced it with a diluted serum, harmless in appearance and useless in practice, and a young rogue girl named Mira Sol seized violently only minutes after receiving it. Mira survived, barely, but the damage to trust in that ward was immediate and lasting. Her father, Tomas Sol, confronted Elara in the hallway outside the recovery room, his voice low with something worse than anger. You decided speed mattered more than our right to know what entered our child's blood, he told her. Elara had no answer that did not sound like an excuse. She had spent so long treating hospital paperwork as her enemy that she had forgotten records, when written by the right witnesses, could protect a child instead of burying them. Care without a witness, she finally understood, could be twisted into exactly the kind of cover-up she had always fought against. Corvin moved quickly to weaponize the incident, framing Elara publicly as a cursed nurse who had nearly killed a rogue child through reckless, unsupervised intervention, and using the fear that followed to push through what he called the blood priority lockdown. Under the lockdown, the lower wards would be sealed entirely. Rogue children transferred out of the hospital altogether. Every pediatric resource redirected toward Cassian's recovery, and Elara herself confined as a contamination risk, while any nurse who had assisted her faced suspension. Every unregistered child in the building was to be reclassified, in official hospital language, as intake overflow. Guards moved through the lower corridors that same night, checking beds against a list that had nothing to do with fever charts and everything to do with paperwork. When a young nurse asked what name to write on the chart of an abandoned infant named Rowan, waiting to be moved out of the clean ward for lacking pack papers, Corvin answered without hesitation, "A name is for a patient we intend to save," he said. Until then, he is intake overflow. He turned the same cold clarity on Elara herself soon after. "Medicine is not mercy, Nurse Wren," he told her. "Medicine is allocation. A child with no pack future cannot outrank the heir who keeps the pack alive." Lucian could have used his authority as Alpha to override the lockdown and protect her outright. Elara stopped him before he tried. If he saved her only through the raw exercise of his own power, the system underneath would remain exactly as broken as it had always been, dependent entirely on one man's mercy instead of any real accountability. What they needed instead was proof no single Alpha command could erase. Working through the following days with anyone willing to stand beside her, Elara built what she began calling the fever map, a structure where every ember in her blood was matched to a living witness rather than carried by her alone. She pinned it, at first to the inside of a supply closet door, index cards and thread connecting a name to a symptom to a signature, until it outgrew the door and moved to an entire wall no one could pretend not to see. She kept the physical fever marks. Hannah kept the medication logs. Dr. Sarah Quinn, a young physician who had once trusted the blood priority system without question, began keeping diagnosis records instead, having seen with her own eyes how Cassian's illness traced directly back to the children below. Tomas kept signed parent consent forms. Lucian, slowly and without being asked twice, began keeping the funding orders that had made the old system possible in the first place. An elderly intake clerk named Amos, quietly furious for years about slips he had been ordered to destroy, produced a stack of refused admission records he had never actually thrown away. Children themselves, or their parents on their behalf, kept the wristbands that had been cut from the hospital's active system entirely. A fever carried by one cursed nurse could be called contamination. Elara told them all, once the map was nearly complete. A fever carried by witnesses became a diagnosis the hospital could not erase. For the first time since Nico's death, Elara let her curse become something other than a secret weight she carried alone. Lucian, changed by what he had already seen, insisted on going down to the lower pediatric wing himself. Without cameras, without the board, without any staged tour meant to flatter his own reputation. What he found there stripped away whatever remained of his certainty. Cribs held children, with no names recorded above them. Oxygen lines were shared between beds that should never have needed to share anything. Medicine boxes sat well past their expiration dates. Nurses recorded symptoms on scraps of paper because no official chart existed for children the system refused to acknowledge. Parents slept on the floor beside their children, and rogue mothers flinched at every footstep, afraid that even a surviving child might be taken from them for the crime of being born without papers. Somewhere down the corridor, a radiator clanked against a wall that had not been painted in a decade, and the smell of antiseptic gave way, floor by floor, to something closer to the smell of a place merely enduring rather than healing. Beneath one vent, Lucian found the same small toys his son had been dropping through the grate for weeks, meant for children he had never known his son could hear. A boy in one of the cribs asked Lucian in a small voice if he was a doctor. Lucian did not know how to answer him. Tomas found him standing there a moment later and did not soften his words for the Alpha King's benefit. "Your name is on the building," he said. His name was never allowed inside it. Lucian did not silence him with rank or command. He simply stood in that corridor and let the truth land, unblocked exactly as it deserved to. "I thought I built a hospital," he admitted quietly, later to Elara. "You built a door," she answered, "and then you decided who was allowed to knock on it." The fever map soon revealed the full shape of what Vale Memorial had become under Corvin's direction. He had been selling real medicine to elite families at a premium, while lower wards received diluted substitutes. The invoices for both hidden behind identical labels, so that only the delivery routes told the truth. Death certificates had been quietly altered to disguise refusals as unavoidable losses. Refused children were recorded, when they were recorded at all, as having simply received redirected care elsewhere, a phrase so clean it could mean almost anything, and had clearly been chosen for exactly that reason. Worse, Cassian's own treatment had drawn on blood resources taken from children who had themselves been denied the recovery care that blood was meant to fund. Elara understood clearly now why the echo fever moved the way it did. Pediatric care had been stratified by bloodline for too long. No child's suffering had ever truly stayed contained to just one bed. Among the children flaring brightest on her map was baby Rowan, the nameless infant Corvin had ordered moved out of the clean ward, his ember burning black, the color Elara had come to fear most. If Rowan died while still carrying that ember, the fever would surge violently back into Cassian, and possibly kill them both at once. Hannah caught Corvin attempting to alter another child's death certificate, while the child, impossibly, was still breathing in the next room. Filing the paperwork early, he explained calmly, to avoid administrative delay later. Elara understood then that Corvin was not simply letting children die. He was preparing the paperwork in advance so that their deaths would look, on record, as though they had always been permitted, inevitable, and clean. Lucian wanted every remaining resource sent to baby Rowan immediately. Corvin warned that doing so risked Cassian's life directly, insisting that if the heir died, the entire pack would follow him into collapse. Lady Maris, predictably, said Cassian came first. Elara refused to let fear make that decision for them. "If we save the heir by letting the nameless infant die," she said, "the fever will come back wearing his face." Nobody in that room argued with her again. With Cassian worsening, baby Rowan worsening, and Mira Sol still dangerously unstable, 3 children bound together by the same echo fever, Elara understood that triage could not be decided by rank, and it could not be decided by anger either. Saving rogue children first, simply to punish the VIP ward for years of neglect, would be its own kind of injustice wearing a nurse's uniform. Justice in a hospital was not revenge in a white coat, she reminded herself, and chose instead to let medical need and the true source of the fever guide every decision that followed. When Lucian asked what she needed to make that possible, her answer was short and absolute. Names, she said, witnesses, medicine without locked doors. Lucian handed her master access to the hospital's entire pediatric system, not as a gift meant to flatter her, but as a genuine surrender of the control his family had held over that building for generations. Corvin locked down the pediatric network in a final attempt to force a Cassian First protocol before anyone could stop him. Elara walked into the hospital's central ward hub anyway, the fever mark along her arm glowing like a map drawn in red ink beneath her skin. She gave her orders exactly as the fever map had prepared her to. Dr. Sarah was to stabilize Cassian without over-medicating him. Hannah was to open the lower ward's oxygen line immediately. Tomas was to hold Mira's signed consent file up to the nearest working camera. Lucian himself was to unlock the Alpha blood bank. Nurses were to move baby Rowan into the clean ward without further delay. Old Amos was to read the refused admission names aloud, one by one, into the hospital's public system. Parents throughout the wards were to hold up their children's cut wristbands as living proof. Corvin fought back the only way he had left, ordering baby Rowan's temporary chart deleted from the system entirely. On the central screen above them, the words Baby Rowan began dissolving into unregistered intake overflow before Elara's eyes. She screamed for it to stop. A child with no pack future cannot outrank the heir who keeps the pack alive, Corvin told her, unmoved, repeating the doctrine he had built his career on. Then your hospital was never healing the pack, Elara answered. It was pricing its children. Lucian moved toward Corvin with the clear intent to strike him down where he stood. Elara caught his arm and stopped him cold. If the Alpha King beat the director senseless in front of the cameras, the story would become a power struggle between two powerful men. The truth underneath it would be lost entirely. What this hospital needed was exposure, not vengeance. She pressed her palm flat against the fever glass, separating the wards, and let the curse open past every limit she had ever allowed it before. The cost arrived instantly and violently. Every ember she had carried for months ignited at once, and her vision blurred with heat that no fever of her own had ever produced. Sweat lifted straight off her skin as though it were boiling away. Red lines raced up from her wrists toward her throat like veins on fire. For 1 second, Elara could not tell whether the heat belonged to the children or to her own blood anymore. The embers burned so many directions at once that her own heartbeat disappeared beneath the fevers she was carrying. But because the fever map already held enough living witnesses, the truth no longer depended on her body alone to survive. Records, names, parent consent forms, medication logs, refused admission slips, and children's wristbands all rose together onto the hospital's public screens for everyone, staff and press and board alike, to see at once. Corvin stood exposed in front of all of it. Baby Rowan received real medicine within minutes. Mira's soul stabilized, and Cassian's fever finally broke. Not because the Alpha heir had been prioritized above every other child in the building, but because the true source of the fever had finally been treated correctly, all the way down to its root. When Cassian woke enough to understand what had happened, he asked his father, in a voice still rough from fever, whether the medicine that saved him had come from somewhere else first. Lucian did not lie to him. If the medicine is mine because they took it from them, Cassian said slowly, working the thought out loud, I don't want to be first. Lucian sat with that sentence longer than he sat with almost anything else that week. The victory belonged to Elara's triage and the witness chain she had built around it, not to any single act of alpha authority. In the hours that followed, Corvin was taken into custody, but Lucian refused to let him carry the blame alone. He stood before the press at the hospital's main entrance, his suit stained with medicine, blood, and rain, looking nothing at all like the man who had walked through those same doors on the night he bought the building. "I did not close the door on those children. With my own hands," he told them. "But I paid for the lock," he announced on that same broadcast the immediate suspension of the blood priority system. He ordered a full investigation into every pediatric death the hospital had recorded. He canceled every elite-only donor contract still active on the books. He froze the entire board pending review. He promised Corvin would face an open medical tribunal, that affected families would be compensated, and that every refused child's record would be reopened. He vowed that the names of children who had died outside the hospital's gates would finally be read aloud and remembered. And he committed, in front of every camera still rolling, to reviewing every order that had ever carried his own signature. Lady Maris stood behind him through the entire announcement, silent, and for the first time in Lucian's memory, she did not argue against a single word of it. She had spent the earlier days of that week insisting the hospital choose the blood that kept the pack standing. Once, mid-sentence, she opened her mouth to say so again, caught sight of Cassian watching her from the doorway of his recovered ward, and closed it without a word. Now she simply watched her son dismantle the very principle she had handed him, and said nothing at all, which was, for a woman like Maris Vale, its own kind of confession. Weeks later, Lucian signed what would become known across the pack as the Open Ward Covenant, dismantling the very hierarchy his own family had helped build, clause by clause, in front of a room that included nurses and parents for the first time in the hospital's history. Pediatric care could no longer be ranked by bloodline. Emergency intake could never again refuse a child for lacking pack papers. Every child denied care had to be logged by name, without exception. No medicine could be transferred without a full witness chain behind it. Parent consent had to be recorded and respected in every case. Private funding could no longer reserve life-saving medicine for elite blood alone. Any cursed medical warning would now trigger an independent review rather than dismissal. Rogue and Omega children were guaranteed emergency care rights equal to any noble child's. Death certificates were required to note any delay or refusal that had occurred, honestly and in full. Hospital boards would now include nurses, parents, and representatives from the lower wards themselves. No alpha order could override a medical triage decision without a witness present. VIP wards could no longer drain resources from active pediatric emergencies elsewhere in the building, and no child could ever again be labeled intake overflow once a living nurse had recorded their name. The clause, Lucian insisted, be carved above the Covenant signing table said more than all the rest combined. No child shall burn outside a healing door because their blood was not valuable enough to open it. Elara was given the role of keeper of open wards, not because Lucian had chosen her, and not because of any bond between them, but because the hospital needed someone with the authority to make sure it never again looked away from the children it had once been so willing to forget. After Cassian finally woke, steady and clear-eyed for the first time in days, Lucian found Elara alone in an old, disused pediatric playroom, far from any camera, board meeting, or ceremony. Dust sat thick along the windowsills, and a row of faded murals, painted years ago by some forgotten hospital volunteer, still covered one wall in fading suns and clouds. Cassian had left a small toy behind a chair for baby Rowan before leaving the ward. And Lucian, seeing it, could not find words for a long moment. The mate bond between them warmed again in the quiet of that room. Undeniable, patient, unhurried. Elara felt the old fear rise with it anyway. The memory of a hospital that had once used her pain as a resource to be managed, weighed, and spent. She did not want gratitude to be the thing that made Lucian claim her as his own. He did not reach for her. He did not tell her she belonged to him. "You saved my son," he said instead. "I saved the ward," she answered. He nodded slowly. Something settling in him that had nothing to do with rank or command. "Then teach me how to keep it open," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation she had learned to expect from every powerful man who had ever walked through that hospital. She did not find it. Whatever came next between them, she decided, could wait behind that promise and be built the same way the fever map had been built, one honest witness at a time. A month later, Vale Memorial no longer had an alpha-only pediatric entrance, and the PAC status scanner that had once guarded the emergency gate was gone entirely, replaced by a simple wall bearing the names of every child the hospital had once refused. Nico Wren's name was among the first ones carved there, and Elara touched it every morning on her way in, the way other people touched a doorframe out of habit rather than need. Elara worked from a new desk near the entrance now, the open ward desk, where Mira Sol came for a follow-up visit, still weak but undeniably alive, her small hand tight around her father's. Tomas had not fully forgiven her, not yet, and Elara had stopped expecting him to. He handed over Mira's updated file without hesitation all the same. "This time, write everything down," he told her. She promised him she would, and meant it in a way she had never quite meant a promise to a hospital before. Cassian visited the lower ward that same afternoon, carrying toys for baby Rowan, with Lucian walking a careful step behind him rather than in front. The way a man learns to walk once he has finally understood which doors are not his to lead through. At the entrance, a rogue mother arrived carrying a child burning with fever, and the guard on duty, out of old habit, began to ask for PAC papers. Lucian glanced toward Elara. Elara did not look at him at all. She looked at the intake nurse instead, and asked the only question that mattered anymore. "Name?" The mother whispered her child's name, and the doors opened without another word. The hospital had once measured blood before fever. Now, under Elara's watch, the first question was not rank, insurance, or PAC papers. It was the child's name, and for the first time since Nico died outside a white door, Elara felt a fever in her blood begin to cool.